All right, so I'll expand on some of the things that were brought up in chapter 5. So this will be the lecture based on chapter 5, the Iberian Peninsula, the last stronghold of the Moors in Granada, Castile and Aragon being the kingdoms that joined forces to finish getting rid of the Moors, the Muslim people. You're introduced in this chapter to noblesse oblige, this idea introduced by the Romans to the Iberian Peninsula that the nobility had this obligation to look after the poor people, the serfs, and yeah. We get introduced to caballero. Caballero, if you've studied any Spanish, you might have heard it with regard to a gentleman. Like if you go to Latin America and you want to know which bathroom, there's damas y caballeros, ladies and gentlemen. And so caballero is a term for gentleman. But with regard to Roman origins of the term, a caballero was a term for a knight, as in a knight in shining armor. And there's also the root word of caballero is caballo, which means horse. So, and then this ends up having implications for Latin America, because under the caste system, kind of the racial order, the racial hierarchy of Latin America during colonial times, if you were Native American, you were not allowed to own a horse, you were not allowed to carry weapons. And so that also meant that if you were Native American, you could not be a caballero. You could not be a gentleman, a knight or a gentleman. And so there's all these legacies of implications that have their origins with the Romans in the Iberian Peninsula. Then there's Hidalgo. So an Hidalgo was kind of a noble person. And so it has to do with being the son of a somebody, hijo de algo or hijo de alguien. So this lineage is showing the importance of lineage, ancestry, that is very prominent in Europe, in the Roman Empire, and then brought to the Iberian Peninsula. So yeah, and then hence no surprise why we see an importance in lineage in Latin America after contact and conquest and colonization. Then there is compadrazgo, which I translate as godparenthood. And so this diagram is trying to show like, you have a child, you have the mother and father, and then you have the godfather, the godmother, and and the child becomes a godchild. So many of you may be familiar with this, but you might not be familiar with these terms of the relationship between the parents and the godparents. In Spanish, the relationship between the parents and the godparents means that they are compadres, which is also very similar to saying like co-parents. And so they're compadres, kind of both, God, when you include both godparents, compadre for godfather, comadre for godmother, compadrazgo to this relationship of godparenthood. Padrino is Spanish for godfather, madrina, Spanish for godmother, ahijado or ahijada would be godson or goddaughter, or ahijado or ahijada. And so, yeah, and in this context, Clawson brings it up as, you know, this is one of the ways in which these ideas of noblesse oblige get passed on, where this idea of, you know, the wealthier people need to look, the nobility need to take care of the serfs, the poor people. But Clawson then makes some connections where it makes it seem like people in Latin America choose godparents based on whether they're wealthy or not. And it's not to say that that has never happened or that it didn't exist. But it's important to demonstrate change over time, because that is not how it is primarily done today. Compadrazgo is still very common today. And the parents tend to pick godparents that are either kind of good role models, or just people that they're close to or want to be close to. And so sometimes it'll be, you know, like they're a sibling or a relative or just a friend. And so it is something that is still around. It's something that's very important, but it's not primarily done in that way that it was done 1,000 years ago. Yeah. Comments, questions? All right. Yeah, so, you know, the chapter talked about the Roman and Moorish influences in architecture. Here you see the arches in Guatemala, the aqueducts in Mexico, the different voyages of Columbus, 4 voyages of Columbus to the Americas. Never set foot in what became the United States, other than maybe Puerto Rico. Just Balboa being an important conquistador, explorer. Here we get introduced to the different conquistadors: Cortez, Coronado, Alvarado, Balboa, Orellana got brought up in your homework, Pizarro. The Incan foundations to buildings that are still being used. The Incan stonework that is still being used. How Brazil was split by the Pope with the Treaty of Tordesillas, this line that said basically everything east of that line is for the Portuguese, everything west is for Spain. And yeah, the Portuguese primarily, you know, were primarily like right on the coast, but theoretically you would go all the way to the Treaty of Tordesillas. The viceroyalties of Spain, there is New Spain, New Granada, and La Plata. And then New Spain, New Granada, and La Plata could also be broken up into smaller entities. And yeah, there's also the interesting thing there where people in Spain and some people in Latin America like to argue that Latin America that they were never colonies. They like to argue that they were viceroyalties. Kind of like saying that they're like subdivisions of Spain. political entities of Spain and not colonies. I'm not convinced by that argument. I think the mercantile system was very much in place, which is ultimately, I think the caste system and the mercantile system are all I need to be able to define them as colonies. They're being exploited. The people are being subjugated for the benefit of the mother country, even if they didn't use the word colonies. The Spanish built a lot of fortresses to protect from other countries and from pirates. And some of them were attacked. Here's the pirate Henry Morgan attacked Panama City in 1671. Here are the ruins of it. Other ruins. The English, took over parts of the Caribbean, hence Jamaica, and why they speak English today. Father Hidalgo, you haven't learned about, or I haven't lectured about, but he's an independence leader for Mexico. The Plaza of the Three Cultures in Mexico City is a place that demonstrates it's trying to say that there's three cultures present in the same place. And so it's showing the pre-Hispanic or Mesoamerican indigenous foundations that are there. Then the Spanish, European, Christian buildings that were built next to them or on top of them. And then the third one would be modern society, just modern buildings in the same space. And so hence the Plaza of the Three Cultures in Mexico. Simón Bolívar is one of the most important independence leaders for South America. Simón Bolívar. That is where we get the name of the country Bolivia from. And so there's statues for Bolívar everywhere. Just like this. I remember seeing one in Colombia, in Cartagena, that looked a lot like this. Clawson finds it interesting to see soldiers on the streets in Latin America, in this example in Lima. Yeah, that is something that people notice. Yeah, that is something that people notice sometimes when they go to Latin America or other countries, like you'll go to a bank or go to a business and there might be a security guard, with an assault rifle, being, just guarding the place. And we're not used to seeing that here so much. So yeah, it can stand out to people when they travel and visit. And the last question from the text, Clawson introduced us to 10 countries that have been militarily occupied by the United States. And here is one source with a list of 56 US military interventions in Latin America, at the center, kind of with the 20th century centered, although it goes 10 years before the 20th century and 12 years after. And these numbers correspond with how many times we've militarily intervened in a country. But yeah, I've read some history books that explain it as the United States militarily intervened in Latin America an average of once every other year.